With its very short playtime, small level count, simple gameplay loop, Kirby's Dream Land came onto the stage in the middle of 1992 and introduced millions to gaming as a whole. Through the genre of 2D side-scrolling, this action platformer allowed those unfamiliar with gaming to take up this interesting hobby. While the game looked fairly simple with its two-tone sprite-based graphics on the Game Boy, its development was quite the opposite. In order to get into the development of Kirby's Dream Land, I think the best place to start is with the creator himself, Masahiro Sakurai. Born on August 3rd, 1970, in Musashimurayama, Tokyo, Japan, Sakurai was always interested in games. He always loved gaming, but his interest in developing games started to grow in university. While he was working to become an industrial engineer, he pivoted to creating games. He would spend hours a day during a 2-year period at university buying and playing games. He experimented and tried to understand what made games tick, or what made them lose his interest. He wanted to figure out why some games would leave him wanting more, or why they didn't. In an interview, he said that he went out of his way to play games he didn't like. Those were the most important for him, since each of those games were like pearls of wisdom. This methodology of researching and building on top of previous creators' experiences allowed for him to grow and develop his skills, and soon he would be able to start his developmental journey in creating games with his directorial debut at 19 years old, with Kirby's Dream Land for the Nintendo Game Boy. Sakurai started his journey into game development with Kirby's Dream Land when he was working at HAL Laboratory. During the development of the game, the dev kits that were being used at the time were twin Famicom systems, which were sharp lessons Nintendo Famicom and Family Disk systems. Using this system led to some complications, as the system itself was not compatible with a mouse, so programming on the system was a nightmare. In order to properly work on this game, Sakurai had to forego a physical keyboard, instead relying on an on-screen keyboard and trackball, which he described as using a lunchbox to make lunch. The machine would then read and write data to floppy disks. This meant that all the tools they made were built on the Famicom hardware, so they were making games for the Famicom on the Famicom. While this was a somewhat unorthodox approach to developing games, this led to some upsides, where they were able to create prototypes in a more efficient manner. Not only was the creation of the game itself difficult, but there were some storage limitations as well. This was due to the limited 512 kilobytes of data that they could work with. This meant that they needed to be as storage efficient as possible. For example, they had to limit the vast differences between sprites, with many characters such as Waddle Dee and Waddle Doo sharing a similar body, or Gordo using different orientations of its body in their design. While Sakurai was trying to save as much storage as possible when making this game, he also wanted to make the boss battles as big as possible, but they also had to save space for this as well. Many of the bosses used the same images, but were either rotated or warped in some way. An interesting workaround that Sakurai implemented on the game was by writing each enemy's movement path manually, since he hadn't built an actual object collision detection system. Now, the origins of Kirby came from the use of a dummy sprite that would then be replaced later on in development with a much more detailed character. But throughout development, the game developers started to get attached to this white puffball and decided to keep it in the final game, which I think was for the best, as the main character of the game was a lot more approachable for first-time video game players. The name of this white puffball was called Po Po Po, with the name of the original series being Po 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 of the Spring Breeze, but was later changed to Twinkle Popo. They were using this name near the game's release, with the promotional material and artwork containing this name. But as the game neared completion at the end of 1991, HAL Labs was preparing to self-publish, with the final game still being called Twinkle Popo. But things were not looking up, as the pre-orders for the game reached around 26,000 units, which was way too little for the amount of development that went into the game. Along with the small amount of orders, there was also an economic collapse just starting in Japan, and heavy development costs for another one of HAL Labs' games, Glory. With this emergency ahead, the company looked towards Nintendo for guidance, especially needing Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Super Mario Bros.'s help. With Nintendo's guidance, a few things changed with the game. First, they decided to publish the game under Nintendo instead of HAL Labs. Next, they cancelled the 26,000 units of pre-sold games. Instead, they revamped the game itself. They increased the size of the game to 2 megabytes of storage and added a new game mode called Extra Game. And finally, they decided to change the game's name. Now, many of these changes were good, allowing some more breathing room for the developers to build their game, but the challenges of coming up with a new name that had to appeal to a wide audience was difficult, to say the least. They wanted to appeal to American children, so they decided to go with Kirby, which is humorous and more appealing than Po Po Po. With this, the game was finished and all the hurdles cleared. One of the things that Nintendo pushed for and helped Sakurai with was the difficulty of the game, as Miyamoto was a fan of its relatively easy difficulty compared to other games at the time. Miyamoto agreed with Sakurai that this game should be a good introduction to people who haven't played games before. The gameplay of Kirby's Dream Land is very simple, as an action platformer on the Game Boy. There aren't many intricate things that they could do with it. You can move Kirby in all directions along with jumping and inhaling enemies. Using this inhaling power, you can shoot a puff of air that can kill enemies as well. Along with this attacking move, you can also just fly away with Kirby's second ability to flap his arms as fast as possible and avoid enemies altogether. This mix of attacking and avoiding enemies allowed for a very forgiving game with a total of 5 levels. Each level is connected through various rooms and hidden doors. These hidden doors allowed for new paths to be unlocked and can act as checkpoints in certain areas. The main goal of each of the levels is to get to the end of the level and beat the boss. Since there was no way for Kirby to change his move when absorbing enemies, the power-ups in this game came in the form of gaining health, breathing fire, or gaining extra lives. This game was very standard in the way it approached a 2D platformer, allowing for people to get their feet wet when playing these games. If you touch an enemy, then you lose some health and gain it back by eating certain foods or collecting certain items. Once you beat the main game, the extra mode allows for more difficulty as well as adjusting how many lives the player can start with. Going with this idea of simple, the story of the game is not too far off, as it starts off in the country of Dreamland, located on a star-shaped planet. The peaceful denizens of Dreamland use sparkling stars to play and work, but one day, late at night, the evil King DDD stole everything from the Dreamlanders. With no sparkling stars and no food, the Dreamlanders starved. This was until Kirby decided to fight against the evil king and take back everything that was stolen from them. Kirby goes through many lands, taking back the stars, and finally he beats King Dedede and returns all the food to stars. See? Simple. Kirby's Dream Land released on April 27, 1992 in Japan, and a few months later in North America and Europe. The game was viewed generally positive, with many liking the quality of the game itself, but still many considered it simple or too basic and somewhat boring compared to later iterations. Although they considered it basic, the reviewers still loved its lighthearted atmosphere and gameplay. With this basic premise, the game shot up from a close flop to being the best-selling game by HAL Laboratory at the time. With its success being cemented, a series of sequels released on many of Nintendo's consoles. This game, while short and simple, was just plain fun to sit back with and relax. The entire game is filled with the simple joys of playing a game. From the simple character designs, the clean and charming worlds, Kirby's Dream Land shows that increasing the difficulty of a game does not always make a better game. Sometimes the ability to sit back, relax, and enjoy a game is what makes the experience a whole lot better. While I think that many of the subsequent games in the Kirby series are a lot better, there are times when I feel like Kirby's Dream Land can scratch that itch. Not only was this game fantastic, but as a directorial debut for Masahiro Sakurai, I think that it shows how much talent he had and it was just starting to bloom. And we can see it now with all the games that he has created and developed. This has been the history of Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy by HAL Laboratory. If you want to watch a video about one man's journey of video game development, click here to watch the history of Cave Story, and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.